The best example of why we should stop centering white men's voices is Lord of the Flies. The man who wrote this was sick. He was sick and twisted. He was bitter. He was a nightmare to his wife and children. He was full of self-pity. He was a raging alcoholic. And this one story that he wrote shaped the way millions of people view men, especially, but humanity in general. Before I dive into this whole thing, I may have to do a part 2, 3, 4, whatever. The reason why this is so important, why I go back and I look at old movies and stories and even news stories from a different lens, and why we should be questioning current events when we start to question our belief system, our ideas around love, our ideas around relationships, or for instance, our ideas around, I don't know, say the United States and our government and our military, or just any of the colonial powers. Who's writing the story? Who's telling the story? We have to think about that. And I'm just going to use the Lord of the Flies as an example of something that I'm hoping people will connect the dots with everything. Even on the level of like rom-coms, which is why I tear those apart now. Because all of those movies, not all, but most of them seem to be like, hey, settle for a man who sucks. Especially if you are a very successful independent woman, date down, whatever. You get my point. The people who have the most power, the most military, the most privilege, and then whether it's in, globally or within relationships, when those people write all the stories, they shape how we think, how we feel, what we do. And so part of my work, my continuous work, is trying to decolonize everything, including the things I consume. So this really great piece in The Guardian a while back, I have not stopped. This is my Roman Empire. I have a few Roman empires. This is one of them because I had to read this book in high school or middle school, whatever, at an impressionable age. I had to read this book. And I, like so many people, including the person who wrote this article, and it's brilliant, had to go back and look at, oh my God, this is where I got my ideas about humanity and more specifically, the nature of men and boys. So anytime men are like, you hate men. No, I don't. The man who wrote this hates men. He hated himself. And because he had lived through the Second World War, he was a chronic alcoholic who never found recovery. And believe me, I have sympathy for alcoholics as an addict myself of different things. But I'm tired of reading the stories written by sick, twisted men who have not healed because it gets into our head and it affects us. I thought all men left to their own devices, including teenage boys or just boys in general, are terrible, terrible human beings. And this story proves that that's not true. This man worked at a boarding school and grew up in a boarding school in the United Kingdom. And if we know anything about boarding schools in the UK, they are known for abusing boys. Just saying. You can find it in Virginia Woolf's writing. So many men who abuse women come from being abused as boys. Not always, but a lot of times. The other thing is that I was a leader of a boys' backpacking trip for 23 days in the wilderness. Talked about this before. And after a lot of hard work, those boys showed me it is not about boys being inherently savage or evil or whatever. It is about toxic masculinity and all of this stuff, whiteness, capitalism, individualism, and all this crap. That is what is making men and boys so sick. And the women who enable them. And all of humanity's sick. But it's all tied together. And it's got nothing to do with the humans being inherently evil, like this book tried to portray. I read more about this author than I ever wanted to know. It took me hours to research this video, by the way. So if you're feeling generous, I'm going to leave my Venmo information up there, but I don't expect anything. The dude in this article for The Guardian, which is not the same as the other one, I'm going to get back to the other in a second. William Golding sought to show in that book that boys were, by their nature, little devils. And that without like the rule of law or whatever, very colonial mindset, rigid rules, that gone unchecked from basically the terrible disease of being human. And that the removal of law and order is what makes that happen. Mind you, this man grew up in the boarding school systems in the UK. and was in the military and had a very out of control life of his own, where he was a chronic alcoholic, could not stop, and even sought the advice from Carl Jung because his drinking and he was so afraid of himself and his dark side that he sought all kinds of things to try to fix, and he couldn't. So he has this impression that, you know what, humans are inherently evil. Bro, stop projecting that stuff onto all of us. Your personal life does not mean that that's what humanity is. That's what patriarchy does. That's what white supremacy culture does. That's what capitalism does. Imperialism, colonialism, all that stuff. That's what that does. And childhood trauma that is not dealt with. Entitlement as a white man that is not dealt with or deconstructed. To assume all people are evil, especially boys and men, that has stayed with us, y'all. This one dude, this book has been translated into like 35 languages, and it's like on the 100 best books of all time or something. It was made into a movie. It's still like a book that kids have to read in a lot of schools. It's like if Peaky Blinders himself wrote a story and all of us had to read it, and then we went on to say Peaky Blinders' view on the world is truth. A war vet, an addict. Man with so much unhealed trauma and violence in his life. And then we have to read Peaky Blinders' take on the world. Like, what? So in this piece, he's trying to challenge that centuries of Western culture has assumed that humans are inherently selfish. Yeah, Western, that's white supremacy culture right there. But then in the last, couple decades or whatever, they've been trying to push back against that, being like, wait, no. First of all, how do we know that's true? Second of all, where's the hope in that? And if y'all know my content, I always, as morbid as these topics are, hope is still at the center, or it's somewhere in everything I do, or I try my best. Because what is the point if you don't have hope? The reason why I'm talking about this story is because every time I talk about men, or humans in general being bad, someone's like, Lord of the Flies. Lord of the Flies didn't happen. It was this man's imagination. But you know what did happen? The real Lord of the Flies was very different, and that's why I'm talking about this. Because there were boys stranded on an island, but they did not unalive each other. So if anybody who hasn't read Lord of the Flies, it's basically a bunch of shipwrecked British boys who try to have a democracy and end up, torturing each other. It's about the end of innocence, which makes sense after the Second World War, why somebody would be in that mindset, especially if they'd been in the war. And then the darkness of man's heart. This story never happened. This was the imagination of a man who worked in the boarding school and was raised in boarding schools. Oh, and by the way, 30 languages it's been translated, not 35. And this author goes on to say, not for a second, when he was a teenager, did he think about doubting Golding's view of human nature. And what made him change his mind is when he learned that the author was an alcoholic prone to depression, who even said himself, I have always understood the because I am of that sort of nature. And it was partly out of that self-knowledge that I wrote Lord of the Flies. This man was aware of his own propensity towards violence and darkness. And so he assumed, like men and white men especially, that everybody is like him. Because when you're told that you are the center of the freaking world, you assume everybody is like you. That you are the default. That is part of whiteness. That is part of patriarchy. That is part of all of the people who are convinced that they're better than others. So this author goes and does a lot of research and finds a real life Lord of the Flies situation that turned out very differently. Please go read this whole article. I don't have time to go into all of it. There was a captain that found 6 boys stranded on an island. So it's a long story. These 6 boys had all been in a boarding school. I can't pronounce this and I don't know how to figure out how to pronounce it. But it had been in the Tongan capital. They basically stole a boat. They were all bored, wanted adventure, and then they got caught in a storm. So something to be noted here is these boys were not white. They were in the UK. Very different cultural background. They were between 13 and 16, just trying to escape. Go to Fiji. For 8 days, they were in the boat. No food, no water. And they worked together to keep each other alive. By the time they were rescued, which it was over a year, they had set up a commune with a food garden, hollowed out tree trunks to store rainwater, had a gymnasium, a badminton court, chicken pens, a permanent fire that was watched over all the time, that it never blew up for over a year. This is them as adults. They worked in teams of 2. They had a strict roster, kitchen, gardens, guard duty. Sometimes they fought and they imposed timeouts. They even made music to lift their spirits. A handmade guitar. When one of the boys broke his leg, the boys set his leg using sticks and leaves and made sure he rested. When they were found, the boy's leg had perfectly healed and all the boys were healthy. What they didn't do is eat each other, terrorize each other. They cared for one another. There's so much more to the story. Comment for part 2.